Story 1. The Lost Highway. Part 1, The Wrong Turn. Emma gripped the map, her fingers leaving damp prints on the paper as she squinted at the faint glow of the dashboard lights. Beside her, Jake yawned, keeping his eyes glued to the ribbon of asphalt stretching endlessly before them. It was supposed to be a simple cross-country drive, one final adventure together before settling down. The plan was straightforward: stick to the main highway, drive through the night, and reach their next stop by dawn. But somewhere along the way, they had veered off course. The clock read 2:47 a.m., and the fuel gauge was dipping perilously close to empty. Emma leaned forward, scanning the road for any sign of life: a gas station, a diner, even a farmhouse. But the landscape was nothing but flat, barren plains, shrouded in darkness. No stars, no moon, just an inky void that seemed to swallow up the horizon. "We should turn around," she suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. Something about the silence felt too heavy, too watchful. Jake glanced at her and then back at the road. "It's fine. The GPS will pick up signal soon enough," he replied, though his fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel. He reached for his phone, but it was useless, just a blank screen that stubbornly refused to connect. "Let's go back," Emma insisted, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror as if expecting to see something lurking behind them. But there was nothing. Only the empty road they had come from. Jake sighed. "If we turn around, we'll just get more lost. Besides, there has to be a town up ahead somewhere." They kept driving. The minutes ticked by, stretching into what felt like hours. The monotonous drone of the tires on asphalt, the hum of the engine, the faint hiss of the static-filled radio, they were the only sounds breaking the silence, and somehow they all felt amplified, each sound unnaturally loud, like a pulse in their ears. After what felt like an eternity, Emma noticed something odd about the road. It was pristine. Too pristine. Not a single crack or patch, no signs of wear, as if it hadn't seen traffic in years. She could have sworn she'd seen the same stretch of highway 3 times already: an old dead tree with branches like skeletal fingers, a crumpled road sign half buried in the dirt, a discarded tire sitting upright by the roadside like a forgotten sentinel. "This doesn't feel right," she muttered, her grip tightening on the map. "It's like we're going in circles." Jake nodded, his jaw clenched. He was trying to stay calm, but she could see the tension in his face, the way his eyes darted from the road to the gas gauge. They were running out of fuel, and fast. "Let's turn around," he finally admitted, his voice taut with unease. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, a chill ran down his spine. The road behind them was cloaked in darkness, a thick blackness that swallowed everything beyond the reach of their headlights. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was a void, impenetrable and alive, as if the darkness itself were watching them. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. "Yeah. Let's go back." He turned the wheel, making a slow, careful U-turn. The car's headlights sliced through the blackness, illuminating the way back. But as they drove, the landscape seemed to shift, subtly at first, then more obviously. The dead tree they had passed before was now on the opposite side of the road, its branches stretching out like claws reaching for them. The crumpled road sign was there too, twisted and faded, its letters illegible but faintly sinister in the dark. Emma's hand found Jake's arm, her fingers cold and trembling. "Jake, is it just me, or does this feel wrong?" He didn't answer, but she could see it in his eyes. He felt it too. The sense that they were no longer on the same highway they'd come from, that they had crossed some invisible boundary into a place that shouldn't exist. A low crackle burst from the radio, startling them both. The static faded in and out, and then a voice, faint, distorted, began to speak. The voice was oddly familiar, but Emma couldn't quite place it. It was as if someone from a distant memory was speaking directly to her. "Emma." "Jake." The voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from a long tunnel. "Turn back." Jake's hand flew to the radio knob, but no matter how much he twisted and turned it, the voice persisted, growing louder, more insistent. "You shouldn't be here. You need to turn back. Now. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. She leaned forward, her eyes wide and searching. Jake, who is that? Why does it sound like? The voice continued, ignoring her question. There's still time. Take the next exit. Leave before it's too late. The next exit? They hadn't seen a single exit for miles. But as they rounded a bend, they saw it, a narrow, barely visible dirt path branching off from the main road, marked by a faded sign with no words, only a hand-painted arrow pointing toward the darkness. Jake slowed down, his grip on the wheel tight. I don't know about this, Emma. This could just be some prank, right? Emma shook her head, her stomach twisting in knots. Who would be out here at this hour? And how do they know our names? The voice on the radio faded to a whisper. Take the exit, it's your only chance. The static crackled, and the voice was gone. Silence settled over the car, thick and oppressive, pressing down on them from all sides. The exit loomed ahead, a yawning maw in the blackness, its edges shrouded in shadow. They exchanged a glance, both of them pale, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperation. What if it's the only way out? Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. They could keep driving, keep hoping for a gas station or a sign of civilization. But deep down, they both knew it was a futile hope. They were alone, lost in a place that felt increasingly unreal, like a nightmare they couldn't wake from. With a shaky breath, Jake turned onto the exit. As they drove down the narrow path, the air grew colder, and a dense fog began to roll in, swirling around them like ghostly tendrils. The headlights barely penetrated the mist, and the road seemed to narrow, closing in on them as if trying to trap them in its embrace. Emma glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking in the fog, but there was only darkness. An all-consuming darkness that seemed to stretch out forever. They drove in silence, their breaths shallow, their hearts pounding. The path wound deeper into the mist, twisting and turning, leading them further into the unknown. And just when they thought they might finally be free, the path ended abruptly, leading them back to the highway. The same stretch of empty road they had just left. Emma's breath hitched, and Jake's knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel. They were back where they started, as if they had never left at all. A familiar crackle came from the radio, and the voice returned, cold and mocking. You can't leave, it whispered. This road has claimed you. The headlights flickered, and for a brief moment, Emma thought she saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, a pale, shadowy figure with hollow eyes staring back at them. But in the blink of an eye, it was gone. They sat in stunned silence, the weight of their predicament sinking in. The highway stretched before them, endless and empty, a dark path that seemed to lead nowhere. And they realized, with growing dread, that they might be driving this road forever, lost in a place that had no beginning and no end. The lost highway had claimed them. Story 2. Part 2, The Strange Signs. The atmosphere in the car was thick with tension. Jake's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and Emma stared out the window, biting her lip. The strange exit they'd taken had led them right back to the endless stretch of highway, and it felt like they were circling something unseen but all-encompassing, an invisible web that tightened with each mile. The air felt colder now, a biting chill that seeped through the closed windows. Emma scanned the darkness, hoping for any sign of an escape. But all she saw was the endless black ribbon of road and the low, twisted shadows of scraggly trees dotting the landscape. Just when she thought she'd go mad from the monotony, a flash of color up ahead caught her attention. Look, Jake, she murmured, pointing. It was a billboard, looming large and weathered, its once bright colors faded and peeling. She squinted, trying to read the message as they passed, but as soon as she caught a glimpse of the words, a cold chill ran down her spine. The sign read, "Welcome back, Emma." She blinked, her heart pounding. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice shaking. Jake nodded, his face pale. It said, "Welcome back." Emma's throat felt tight, her mind racing. It was impossible. No one knew they were here, and no one knew her name. She tried to laugh it off, tried to tell herself it was a trick of the mind, but the sense of dread in her stomach refused to fade. They kept driving, the oppressive silence pressing down on them, when another sign appeared, this one smaller and more worn. The words were scratched out, but beneath the flaking paint, Emma could make out a phrase, "Emma, you left him." A sharp, sickening pang twisted in her gut. Memories she'd buried deep began clawing their way back to the surface. She tried to shake it off, but the guilt and pain felt as fresh as if they'd only happened yesterday. "Did you see that one too?" she whispered, her voice barely a whisper. Jake nodded slowly, his eyes darting nervously around them. "It said you left him?" His gaze slid toward her, filled with unspoken questions and fears he'd long since buried. Emma didn't respond, her mind spinning with memories she hadn't thought about in years. The summer after college, the whirlwind romance with Ben, the desperate goodbye as she left for a life she'd always dreamed of. She had left him behind, left him without explanation. How could the road know that? They drove in silence, the oppressive feeling growing with each mile. The air in the car was colder now, thick with the scent of something metallic, like rusted iron. Another sign loomed ahead, this one larger and more menacing. The words on it seemed to pulse with an inner light, burning into their minds as they passed. "Jake, remember what you did?" Jake flinched, his hands tightening on the wheel. The words hit him like a slap, dredging up memories he had tried so hard to bury, nights spent lying awake, haunted by regret, by decisions he couldn't change. He didn't dare look at Emma, didn't want her to see the fear in his eyes. "Jake?" Emma's voice was tentative, probing. She wanted to ask, wanted to understand, but something in his expression warned her to stay silent. The silence in the car felt alive, buzzing with tension. Another sign came into view, this one right on the edge of the road, so close they could almost reach out and touch it. The past always catches up. Emma's heart raced as she turned to Jake, but he was staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the road as if refusing to acknowledge the message. She felt a knot of dread in her stomach, a sickening certainty that this highway was no ordinary road. It wasn't just taunting them, it was peeling back layers, revealing the secrets they'd kept from each other, and themselves. "Jake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is this place?" He didn't answer. His face was pale, his eyes dark and haunted. He pressed his foot down harder on the gas, his only response a grim determination to escape whatever trap they'd stumbled into. Another sign appeared, the letters scrawled in a crude, almost childlike handwriting. "Emma, he's still waiting." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She felt as though she were being watched, as if the eyes of the person she'd left behind were fixed on her from somewhere beyond the veil of darkness. Her voice was shaky when she finally spoke. "Jake, this can't be real. There's no way these signs could be about us." Jake shook his head, his face drawn and tense. "Maybe it's some kind of prank? Some sick joke? Who would even know?" she whispered, hugging herself tightly. "Who could know about these things?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as another sign flashed by. This time, the letters were scrawled in what looked like blood, dripping down the weathered wood. "You can't escape." The radio crackled suddenly, filling the car with a low, whispering static that seemed to echo the words on the sign. Emma and Jake exchanged a glance, their fear reflected in each other's eyes. A faint, distorted voice came through, like a whisper from somewhere far away. It was muffled, broken by static, but they could make out the words. "You can't leave." Jake reached for the radio dial, trying to turn it off, but the voice grew louder, clearer. "You're running out of time." The headlights dimmed for a moment, and in the brief darkness, Emma thought she saw something on the road ahead, a figure standing motionless, staring directly at them. She gasped, clutching Jake's arm, but when the lights came back, the figure was gone, leaving only the empty road stretching endlessly before them. Jake swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. He couldn't explain the fear clawing at his insides, the sense that they were being hunted, pursued by something unseen and inescapable. They continued driving, each mile feeling longer, each sign a twisted reminder of their pasts. Memories they tried to forget came rushing back, brought to life by the cruel words on the signs. "Remember, Jake? You said you'd never forget. Emma, did you think he'd forgive you?" The signs became more frequent, each one hitting closer to home, dredging up secrets and regrets they'd hidden even from each other. The air grew colder, thick with an unnatural chill that seeped into their bones, filling the car with the smell of decay. Emma closed her eyes, fighting the urge to scream. She couldn't escape the feeling that they were no longer driving alone, that something was out there, lurking just beyond the reach of the headlights, watching, waiting. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to get out of here." Jake didn't respond. His face was a mask of determination, but beneath it, she could see the terror in his eyes, the desperation clawing at him as he struggled to keep them moving forward. Another sign loomed ahead, larger and more ominous than the others. The words were barely legible, but she could make them out, etched in dark, jagged letters. "There's no going back." Emma felt a cold hand of dread close around her heart. The signs weren't just warnings, they were a sentence. A fate they couldn't escape, no matter how far or fast they drove. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she realized the horrifying truth. They were trapped, caught in a place that knew their deepest regrets, their darkest secrets. A place that wouldn't let them go until it had stripped them bare, forced them to confront the shadows they'd spent their lives running from. The voice on the radio returned, soft and taunting, echoing the words from the signs. "You're almost there, just a little farther." The air grew colder still, and Emma realized, with a sinking feeling, that they weren't alone. Shadows flitted at the edge of the road, shifting and twisting, as if something unseen was moving alongside them, drawing closer with every mile. She reached out, clutching Jake's hand, her voice barely audible. "Jake, what if this is it? What if we're never getting out?" He squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with a helplessness she had never seen before. "Then we keep going," he whispered, his voice thick with fear. "We keep going until there's nowhere left to run." And as they drove on, surrounded by the silent, watching shadows, they realized the road wasn't leading them to safety. It was leading them deeper into the darkness, into a place that held their pasts in its twisted grip. The Lost Highway had only just begun to reveal its secrets. Story 3. Part 3, The Voice on the Radio. The silence had grown oppressive, thick and suffocating. The darkness outside seemed to press in from all sides, so black it felt almost alive, wrapping around the car as they sped down the endless, empty highway. Desperation clawed at Emma and Jake, pulling them deeper into a sinking feeling that there was no escape. Maybe we should try the radio?" Emma suggested, her voice a faint tremor. The silence was maddening, and she needed something, anything, to fill it. Jake hesitated, his jaw tense, but after a moment, he reached out and twisted the radio dial. A low static filled the car, a broken hiss that buzzed through the speakers, the only sound in their dark, isolated world. Then, through the static, a voice emerged, a familiar voice, one that made Emma's heart skip a beat. "Emma." "Jake," the voice was faint but recognizable, sending a chill through her spine. She exchanged a glance with Jake, who was frowning, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Is that?" Emma whispered, barely daring to say the name. The voice on the radio grew clearer, the static fading slightly as the words became more distinct. "Emma, it's been so long," it said, soft and warm, almost as if the speaker were sitting in the car with them. "I've missed talking to you." Emma's blood ran cold. It was Grace, her old friend from college, the friend she'd lost touch with years ago after their lives had gone in separate directions. She hadn't heard Grace's voice in almost a decade. "Grace," she breathed, her hand gripping Jake's arm. Jake's face paled. "Emma, this can't be possible. She doesn't know where we are, she doesn't even have this number." Emma shook her head, her heart pounding. But It sounds just like her. The voice continued, as if hearing her thoughts. Emma, remember when we used to talk about leaving everything behind? Running away to find something better, something real? Emma swallowed hard. She remembered those nights well, long talks with Grace, both of them dreaming about lives far from the ones they were living. They'd made promises, whispered secrets, but those dreams had faded, and she hadn't spoken to Grace in years. But here it was, a voice from her past, echoing back memories she'd thought long forgotten. "Turn it off, Emma," Jake muttered, his eyes darting nervously to the radio. "Whatever this is, it's not Grace." She nodded, reaching for the dial. But the radio wouldn't turn off. She tried again, twisting the knob harder, pushing every button she could find, but the voice persisted, growing louder, clearer. "Why did you leave, Emma?" Grace's voice asked, her tone laced with a strange mix of sadness and reproach. "I thought we were friends." Emma's hand froze on the dial. Her pulse quickened as she looked at Jake, who was now visibly distressed. "This is insane," he whispered. "There's no way this can be real." He tried turning off the radio himself, pushing and pulling at the controls, but the voice continued, unfazed by their attempts to silence it. "Jake," the voice said, softening. "Remember the last time we spoke? You said you'd call. You never did." Jake flinched, as if struck. His face turned ashen, and Emma saw a flicker of guilt flash across his eyes. "Who is that?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is this someone you know?" Jake didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the road, his jaw clenched tight, his hands gripping the wheel like a lifeline. "Jake, you can't hide from it," the voice continued, almost affectionate. "You've run long enough. It's time to face it, don't you think?" "Face what?" Emma asked, her voice breaking. "What is it talking about, Jake?" He shook his head, his expression tortured. "I don't know. I don't understand any of this." But Emma could see the fear in his eyes, the way his hands trembled on the wheel. Whoever this voice was, it knew things about both of them that no one else could possibly know. "Emma," Grace's voice cooed through the speakers, almost soothing. "You always dreamed of escaping, of running away. Remember how we used to sit up all night, planning our big adventure?" Emma's throat tightened. The words cut deep, bringing back memories of days she hadn't thought about in years, memories tinged with regret and longing. But there was something off about the voice, a strange, sinister undertone that made her skin crawl. "Emma, I know you're scared," the voice said, growing more insistent. "But you're almost there. You just have to keep going." She felt a surge of dread as the words settled over her, thick and heavy. "Almost where?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it continued with a question of its own. "Do you remember that night, Emma? The night you decided to leave him?" Her heart pounded as she realized the voice wasn't just a memory, it was a taunting reminder, dredging up moments she'd fought to bury. Memories of choices she wished she could undo, people she had hurt, promises she hadn't kept. Jake's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his gaze locked straight ahead, but she could see his expression twisting in the dim light, his face a mask of barely concealed guilt. The voice turned its attention to him. "Jake," it purred, deceptively gentle. "What about you? You thought you could forget, didn't you? Leave it all behind, like it never happened." Jake's face went pale, his mouth opening as if to protest, but no words came out. He glanced at Emma, his eyes wide and haunted, before turning his attention back to the road. The voice grew louder, almost mocking now. "You can't run forever. You can't keep hiding. Keep going, you're almost there." Emma reached for the radio dial again, desperate to turn it off, but it was as if the controls were frozen, locked in place. She could feel her heart racing, a deep, primal fear clawing at her insides. "Jake, please, do something," she whispered, her voice cracking with terror. He shook his head, his hands trembling on the wheel. I don't know what to do, Emma. I don't know how to make it stop. They drove on in silence, the radio's crackling static filling the car, the voice growing more distorted, echoing their fears, their regrets. It was no longer just Grace's voice, it was a twisted amalgamation of voices from their past, merging together into a haunting chorus that taunted and accused, dredging up their most painful memories. Emma, you left him, the voices chanted, each word dripping with accusation. Jake, remember what you did, they whispered, cold and unforgiving. Emma felt tears prickling at her eyes, her chest tight with a suffocating sense of guilt and shame. She reached out, grabbing Jake's hand, desperate for some sense of comfort, some reminder that they weren't alone in this nightmare. But as their hands touched, the radio's static shifted, and a new voice emerged, softer, almost gentle. It's okay, it said, a note of kindness in its tone. You don't have to be afraid. You're almost there. A faint, flickering hope sparked in Emma's chest, and she clung to Jake's hand, squeezing tightly. The voice continued, its tone soothing, as if it were guiding them towards something better. Just keep driving. Don't look back. You're almost there. For a moment, she felt a flicker of relief, as if maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was finally ending. But then, the voice shifted, its tone darkening, a cruel edge slipping into its words. But you can't escape the past, it whispered, almost gleeful. It's always waiting, just around the corner. The car shuddered as the temperature dropped further, frost creeping across the windows. Emma's breath fogged in the cold air, her heart pounding as the voice continued, relentless. You've run long enough. It's time to face the truth. Both of you. She glanced at Jake, his face pale and haunted, and saw the reflection of her own terror mirrored in his eyes. The voice grew louder, filling the car, a relentless whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Keep going, it urged, its tone a sickening blend of encouragement and malice. You're almost there. Emma's hand tightened on Jake's, their fingers interlaced, clinging to each other as they drove forward into the darkness, their deepest fears and regrets laid bare. And as the road stretched on, endless and unyielding, the voice followed them, whispering their secrets into the night, guiding them deeper into the shadows. In this part, the radio becomes a tormentor, dredging up Emma and Jake's pasts while leading them further into the unknown. The voice takes on an unsettlingly familiar tone, making them question their decisions and confront the hidden regrets that bind them to the road. Story 4. Part 4, The Ghost of the 24-Hour Diner. Jake's grip on the steering wheel loosened as the headlights revealed something up ahead, a faint, flickering neon light cutting through the darkness. The sign read, 24-Hour Diner, its glow casting an otherworldly green hue on the empty road. Emma and Jake exchanged a weary look. It was the first sign of civilization they'd seen in what felt like hours. Do you think it's real? Emma asked, her voice shaky. She'd grown accustomed to the twisted, taunting signs along the highway, and the idea of anything normal, something as simple as a place to sit down and eat, seemed almost surreal. Maybe it's worth checking out, Jake replied, pulling into the small, cracked parking lot. The diner sat just off the highway, its faded red and white paint peeling under the dim glow of the sign. A few old cars were parked out front, covered in a layer of dust that suggested they hadn't moved in years. Still, the diner's lights were on, casting a warm glow into the night. As they stepped out of the car, Emma felt a strange chill prickling along her skin. The air smelled stale, with a faint undertone of something metallic. But the allure of a warm meal and a break from the haunting silence drew them forward. They pushed open the glass door, and a bell jingled, its sound muted and hollow. The inside was eerily clean, the checkered floors and red vinyl booths frozen in a perfect, mid-century style that looked almost too pristine, like a museum display. A waitress stood behind the counter, her face obscured as she methodically wiped down a glass. She looked up as they entered, her eyes dull and unfocused, like she was seeing them from far away. Sit anywhere you like, she murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper. Emma and Jake hesitated, glancing around the empty diner. There were a few patrons scattered about, their heads bowed, faces turned away as they muttered to themselves. An old couple sat in the corner, their hands intertwined, staring blankly at their coffee cups. At a table near the jukebox, a young man gazed out the window, his eyes distant, his expression blank. Something was off. Each patron was disturbingly still, barely moving, their skin a ghostly pallor. But hunger and exhaustion overpowered their instincts to leave, and they slid into a booth near the back, trying to ignore the unsettling atmosphere. The waitress shuffled over, a worn notepad in hand. Her face was expressionless, her eyes cloudy, as though she hadn't slept in years. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice flat. Emma nodded, not meeting the woman's gaze. "Yes, please." "And, can we see a menu?" The waitress seemed puzzled for a moment, as if she hadn't heard Emma's request. Then, with a slow nod, she placed a couple of tattered menus in front of them and shuffled back toward the counter. Emma and Jake glanced at the menus, the faded text listing old-fashioned diner fare, meatloaf, pot roast, pancakes. But the descriptions were strange, written in a peculiar style with phrases like, "as good as it was in '58, and the best in town, since 1963. "Something's not right here," Jake muttered, glancing around. "These people, they're all staring at nothing. And it's like they don't even see us." Emma tried to shake off the creeping unease. "It's just a small-town diner. Maybe they're just tired or shy." The waitress returned with 2 cups of coffee, setting them down with hands that seemed to tremble slightly. As Emma reached for her cup, the waitress leaned in, her voice a whisper that sent chills down her spine. "You should go," she murmured, her eyes flicking nervously to the other patrons. "This place isn't for you." Emma's hand froze on her coffee cup. What do you mean?" But the waitress had already turned away, her movements slow and stiff as she retreated to the counter. Emma and Jake exchanged a glance, unease prickling at them. Jake took a sip of his coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. "Maybe we should leave. This place is giving me the creeps." Emma nodded, her gaze drifting to the other patrons. The old couple in the corner hadn't moved an inch. The young man by the window continued to stare outside, his face pale and expressionless. And then, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The young man's reflection in the window, it was off. The reflection didn't quite match his movements, it lagged a split second behind, like a distorted echo of reality. She nudged Jake, her voice barely a whisper. Look at him." Jake followed her gaze, his face draining of color as he noticed the same disturbing detail. The young man's reflection was staring directly at them, even though he was still facing the window. And as they watched, his mouth twisted into a faint, unnatural smile. "Okay," Jake whispered, sliding out of the booth. "Let's go. Now." They hurried to the door, but as they pushed it open, they found themselves back at the booth. The diner's interior hadn't changed, they were staring at the same faded decor, the same patrons, all still seated and eerily still. Jake's heart raced as he looked around in panic. How did we get back here?" Emma shook her head, her hands trembling. Maybe we just took a wrong turn. Let's try again." They walked back to the door and pushed it open. But again, they were back at the booth, the coffee cup still sitting on the table, steam curling into the air as if they'd just been poured. A sickening sense of dread settled over them. The waitress was watching them now, her expression sad and pitying. She leaned in, her voice barely audible. "No one ever leaves. Not since the accident." Emma's pulse quickened. "What accident?" The waitress glanced around, her eyes darting toward the other patrons as if afraid of being overheard. "There was a fire, a long time ago. It trapped everyone inside. Most of us didn't make it out." Jake's hand tightened around Emma's, his face pale. "But that can't be. I mean, this place looks fine. There's no sign of fire damage." The waitress gave a bitter smile. "That's because you're seeing it as it was, not as it is." She gestured toward the other patrons, who remained motionless, locked in their silent, eerie stares. We're all trapped here, waiting. Some of us don't even realize we're dead." Emma's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding with a cold, paralyzing fear. "You mean, we're—" The waitress shook her head, her expression sad. "Not yet. But if you don't leave soon, you'll be just like us." Emma's hand shook as she clutched Jake's arm. "We tried leaving. The door, it just brings us back here." The waitress nodded. "It's the diner. It doesn't let anyone go once they've come in. But there is a way, if you can find it." Jake's eyes narrowed. "How? How do we get out?" The waitress hesitated, glancing around once more. "There's a door in the back, the one marked employees only. It's different. If you go through it, you might find your way out." They didn't need to be told twice. They pushed past the counter and hurried toward the back of the diner, finding the small, unmarked door with a faded "Employees Only" sign. Their hands shook as they pushed it open, revealing a narrow hallway lined with dusty, flickering lights. They stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind them with a heavy, echoing thud. The hallway stretched on, twisting and turning, the lights growing dimmer with each step. Shadows danced along the walls, and Emma swore she heard faint whispers, voices calling to them from somewhere far away. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling. Are we really going to get out of here?" He squeezed her hand, his face set with determination. "We have to try." They walked down the hallway, each step echoing in the eerie silence. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker, thicker. And then, just as Emma was beginning to lose hope, they saw it, a faint light up ahead, a door at the end of the hall. They broke into a run, their footsteps pounding against the floor as they raced toward the light. But as they reached the door, a figure stepped into their path, blocking their way. It was the young man from the diner, his expression blank, his eyes empty. His mouth twisted into a cruel smile as he spoke, his voice hollow. "You can't leave," he murmured. "Not until you understand." Emma felt a surge of panic as he reached out, his cold fingers brushing against her arm. She pulled away, her voice breaking. "Understand what?" The young man tilted his head, his eyes gleaming with a sinister light. "We're all here for a reason. Every one of us, guilty of something we can't escape." Emma's heart pounded as she realized the truth. This wasn't just a diner, it was a purgatory, a place for lost souls to face their sins, to be trapped in an endless loop of regret and remorse. She turned to Jake, her voice a desperate whisper. "We can't stay here. We have to get out." Jake nodded, his face set with determination. Together, they pushed past the young man and burst through the door, into the blinding light beyond. As they stepped into the light, they found themselves back on the highway, their car parked on the side of the road. The diner was gone, vanished without a trace, as if it had never been there at all. They climbed into the car, their hands shaking, their minds reeling with the horror of what they'd just experienced. And as they drove away, the voice on the radio crackled to life once more, whispering a final, chilling message. "You can run, but the road never forgets. We'll be waiting." This segment plunges Emma and Jake into the nightmare of the ghostly diner, where they confront not only trapped spirits but also their own sense of guilt and remorse, realizing that their journey may be a twisted path of redemption, or damnation. If you like this scary horror video, subscribe my YouTube channel for more new interesting scary video. Thank you.